Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. Thank you for joining me. I'm continuing to look in Romans 9 through 11 at God's work with Israel, and we're doing this because Paul is demonstrating that Israel has not been separated from God's love. So that promise has not been altered. Therefore, likewise, his promise to us at the end of Romans 8 in the body of Christ is that we will also not be separated from his love. And we can be assured of that because he is good to his promise for Israel. And so we pick up in verse 11, so I then say, did they stumble in order that they might fall? The idea with these two words, they stumbled in the past with the potential that they might continue to fall. That is the idea to never get up again is probably what's being implied. He says, let that never be. Rather, through their trespass, and in some of your English Bibles are going to have the word transgression, which would be a translation of a Greek word parabasis, not the word parptoma. Parptoma was a trespass. It was an unrighteous activity that a person did, but they seemed to be able to excuse it in their mind. They seemed to find that there was a good reason for it, whereas a transgression was just a blatant breaking of a law. And Paul actually references that back in Romans 4. So he says, rather through their trespass, Israel excused what they did in rejecting Christ, and that trespass, if you remember back in the previous verses, had to do with Christ came as the king, and rather than receiving him as a king and setting a king's banquet table before him, they gave him gall and vinegar when they rejected him and sent him to the cross. And so their trespass is salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, Jesus references something to this effect in John 4 when he tells the Samaritan woman, salvation is of the Jews. Why? Because that's where God had given his revelation. He hadn't been giving revelation primarily to the Gentiles. His revelation was primarily given to the Jewish people. Moses primarily wrote to the Jewish people, really. The prophets, nearly all the prophets and all their writings were chiefly for the Jewish people. Not exclusively, but primarily. Let's say 98%, and that's just throwing a number out there. I didn't go calculate what portion has some direction to Gentiles. And so he says here, salvation has come to the Gentiles because today that message goes out to us, and it doesn't have to go through the channel, the avenue of Jewish believers. They're not the ones that have to come and give me that revelation. They're not the ones that have to come and proclaim that to me. And so now it has come to the Gentiles, and it's designed that way to make, he says, Israel jealous. In other words, Paul says he's going to tell us he takes advantage of this to try to motivate them to jealousy or to zeal so that they will turn back to God. So if their trespass is the riches of the world, if their failure is the riches for the Gentiles, then how much more will I don't believe full inclusion is what he means here, though the ESV has full inclusion. It's simply the word pleroma, fullness. And he's contrasting fullness, if we go back up in the context up here, to verse 5, so too at the present time there is a remnant. So he's contrasting a remnant, a portion, a little bit of Jewish people that are in the body of Christ at the present time, compared to a time in the future in which there will be a fullness. So we have full over here, and then they've added full inclusion, but the fullness. In other words, there's a time coming in which, when God is done dealing with the church, his work is going to turn back and focus primarily on the people of Israel, and carry on a different work. And in that context there's going to be a full number of Israelis that are going to turn to God. Not a minority, not a remnant, not a little bit. So Paul says, now I am speaking to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle of the Gentiles. Now that was God's commissioning to Paul. Paul did go to Jews, but Paul's real command, his real charge from God, was to take the good news to the Gentiles, because in the present time, the church, the body of Christ, is chiefly comprised of people from a Gentile background. Now, if you're in the body of Christ, and I want to be very clear on this, and we've talked about this in videos prior to these studies in Romans here, chiefly, if you're in the body of Christ, regardless of whether you were a Gentile or Jew, your identity is changed now. God does not count you as a Jew. He does not count you as a Gentile. He counts you as part of the body of Christ. Your identity is changed in the mind of God. And Paul says this multiple times. There's no more Jew or Gentile. No more Jew or Gentile. Not in the body of Christ. Our identity is different. But he was reaching out to people who were of Gentile extraction, and he says, "I magnify my ministry. I make it glorious, if somehow I might provoke to jealousy, or make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them." In other words, if by reaching out to you Gentiles, which not that he doesn't care about the Gentiles, but it also, he says, can have the positive side effect that some of those Jews might be moved to jealousy or to zeal. They might be provoked, and some of them might be saved. And certainly some of them, some out of them, with their expression for a portion in that group. So he says in verse 15, "For if their rejection, if they're literally being kind of cast aside, means then the reconciliation of the world, then what does he say? Their reception, bringing in close here, bringing in to him, mean but life from the dead." So he's looking at a time in the future in which God is going to take up his work with Israel, bring Israel back to himself, and it's not going to then cast the Gentiles aside in the world, but it is going to mean some new things for those that are of a Gentile background. And so he says in verse 16, "If the dough offered as first fruits," and so he's using an illustration right out of the idea of bringing first fruits to the law. "If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, then so are the branches." And we're going to come back and talk a little bit more on the whole issue of the branches and the wild olive branch, what that's talking about in the future, or in this context. But we're going to look at that tomorrow. But he says here in verse 16, "If that dough offered as first fruits is holy," looking at the fact that the people of Israel, they were kind of the foundation of what God first was doing when he started the church. He did begin with Jews. The church was almost exclusively Jewish, except for a few Gentiles that were part of what Judaism did and practiced at that time. But chiefly, they were Jews. But it took a very short time then, as they carried the gospel, as they were forced out of Jerusalem, out into Judea, out into Samaria, and eventually out into the further Gentile places, where they took the gospel to the Gentiles as God had instructed them to do, as Christ specifically had instructed them to do. And they took that gospel out, and as they did, then guess what? Those Gentiles that hear the good news, those Gentiles that believe it, also become holy, which is what we are. But we're not being included, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, we're not being included in Israel. This is a completely different matter, and we'll pick that up then. Again, Israel, as he's saying, there's a remnant today. There's a time coming in which the fullness is going to be there. See, Israel has not been cut off from God's love. Otherwise, there would be no fullness in the future. But there will be. And just as they are not cut off from God's love, and I know I repeat this again and again, but that's the chief point in these 3 chapters that Paul's demonstrating. If they're not cut off from God's love, then we are not cut off from God's love. Isn't that a great thing to know? Encourage you, think about that, and have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me.